Well, welcome, Jamie Ford.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Jamie, in Songs of Willow Frost, who are the main characters in the book, and what are their main conflicts?
Oh, well, it's a mother-son story. So the main character's young William. He's 12 years old. He's an orphan. And then the other character, shaded in mystery for a little bit, is Willow Frost, whose real name is Lu Song, who also happens to be William's mother. And the main conflict is that they are separated. William's orphaned, or so he believes, and he's searching for answers. He's searching for what happened to his mother. Is she still out there? And Willow's story is one of really surviving her circumstance and hoping possibly to reconcile some things that happened in her past.
Well, now, what are some of the main settings, and do these settings really exist?
The settings really exist. Some of them really do. I mean, the book is set in Seattle, and it begins at the Sacred Heart Orphanage, which was a very real place. It was a real orphanage. It's now it's called the Villa Academy. It's a private school, but the grounds are still there. There's still the remains of this sacred grotto. It was an orphanage during the Depression that parents who couldn't afford to feed their children could consign their children there for a time, and hopefully they would come back. There's also places like the Smith Tower. There's a Chinese room at the top of the Smith Tower, and there's all these furnishings that were donated by the last empress in China. And there's a chair called the wishing chair, and whoever sits in the wishing chair, according to tradition and legend, is to be married within a year. And also another place, going through a lot of locations now, but the ones that stand out, the other one is the Wami Club, which is a backroom gambling parlor in Chinatown, that during the time period was, it's where people went for, before Vegas, you had these, in Prohibition times, you had these places where people went for booze and dancing and gambling and other forms of salacious fun, and that also happens to be where my grandparents went.
Well, I was going to say, what inspired you to write this story?
Speaking of those grandparents, it was that story. It was the story of my grandfather being a blackjack dealer and a croupier, a stick man, or whatever they call those guys. And my grandmother was a coat check girl. And that was where they met. They remained married for 60 plus years, but I was always fascinated that there was this place that, with a wink and a nod, people knew of, that was the centerpiece of the community.
Well, now, how does the idea of forgiveness play into this story?
Oh, the book is really, I really don't think about themes of the book until I'm finished, and then I reflect back and they seem very obvious, and forgiveness, abandonment. It's really it's a complicated family story, and it's a story of a mother and a child both really having to understand each other and forgive one another for the situation that they're in, and to adjust to those realities.
Well, now, Willow always knew where her son was, so why didn't she come back sooner?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's what makes great fiction. Sometimes I call this the logical madness of parenting, where sometimes you make it might be a tragic decision, but you have the best intentions. And I think Willow's circumstances were so difficult that she thought she was doing her son a favor, that he would have a better life without her than with her, and then her circumstances changed.
Well, now you say that the characters are made up of, they're just made up, but that your intentions are true. Tell me a little more about that.
Like Willow Frost, like Hotel in the Corner Bar and Suite, the characters are made up, but their circumstances were true to the time, and their circumstances applied to a lot of people. I'd been on book tour just for a few days, but I've already had people who had grown up in an orphanage come to my events and pass me notes, sharing their experiences and acknowledging that they really related to the plight of the characters. And it all came from a point of research. And so I hope that while the characters are made up, people will understand that there's a spirit of the book, of what I was trying to transcribe to the reader, the type of story that I'm promising, and I hope they feel that the circumstances were real, the circumstances were true, because they were based on actual events.
Oh yes, it feels very, very true and very real. This book began as 12 hastily scribbled pages, okay? So tell us, how did that happen?
Oh, I was doing all this research at the time period, and I had started Willow's story, and I knew a thrust of her story and a destination for her story, but I hadn't quite figured out the whole story. And I was asked to read at a fundraiser in Seattle. It's called Bedtime Stories. It's for Humanities Washington, and it's this gala event with 400 people in black tie, and they invite 5 authors to come and read just a little something original. And I had all this research on my plate, and some of it led to the orphanages. So I wrote this little bit about an orphan wondering about his parent, and going to the theater and seeing an actress and recognizing that actress as his mother. And that's when I realized, oh, this character and this character, they're related. There's my story right there. And so that little snippet really was the final, that was the frosting on the cake of what I was trying to put together.
That's great. Well, in 2 or 3 words, describe your agent, Kristen Nelson.
Relentlessly nice. Yeah, I love Kristen. Kristen is awesome, and she's. I was always told that if you're a really nice guy, you need a barracuda for an agent, and if you're kind of a jerk that gets into trouble, then you need a nice agent to clean up your messes. And I found that Kristen's the best combination of both, because she's so, she's not a New Yorker, she's a Midwesterner, she's very professional and pleasant, but she's a bulldog when it comes to negotiating.
Wow.
But she doesn't leave the other party feeling like they were in a knife fight in an alley. She's just she's a consummate professional, and she really understands new media, the changing landscape in the publishing world, which changed. It probably changed right now since noon. It's just constantly changing,
true.
and she's really on top of that.
Well, now
That was more than 3 words. Sorry.
You've said that your Ballantine editor, Jane Von Maren, saved you from yourself. Okay, explain.
I think that's what a good editor does. I was talking to an author friend just last night about how it seems like there's a phenomenon sometimes. Some authors become these mega authors, and then no one wants to edit them because they think everything they do is crystal perfection. And I think editors help us to tell a story, to telegraph a story that is salient to the reader. And by that I mean Jane was wonderful at bringing more out. I'm kind of a minimalist writer, and with both Hotel and Songs of Willow Frost, through the edit process, instead of the manuscript getting smaller, it grew by about 30 pages each time, because she would find something and say, I want a little more backstory on this, and that would become a chapter. And for some people, that was their favorite chapter. And Jane really brought that out.
Well, now, you call the place where you write Storyland, or maybe I should ask, who does? Who calls that Storyland?
I think my wife designated this place as Storyland.
That would be Leisha?
That would be Leisha. Yeah, when I'm really in the thick of writing, she can remind me, like, okay, at 7 o'clock tonight, there's a varsity volleyball game, and we have to go here, and we got to pick up the children, and then at 6:45, she'll be heading out the door, and I'm like, where are you going? And she's like, I explained this to you. But in Storyland, I tend to be so focused on the story that you become a little bit of the nutty professor, a little oblivious to stuff that's around you.
Yes.
I'm not so much like the house is on fire and I'm just typing away, but she forgives me for being a little forgetful during those time periods.
Well, now, where did you learn to write so beautifully, and when was your first break?
Where did I learn to write? It's interesting because my degree is in art and design, so I don't have a traditional literary background. I don't have an MFA in creative writing, but I was always fumbling around with poetry, fumbling around with fiction, essays, and I always, I think if you really want to do it, you can figure it out. I mean, there are self-taught musicians and things like that if they just put the time in and aren't afraid to make the mistakes that you need and to face the tough criticism that sometimes you are required, sometimes just of yourself, self-criticism to get better. That was part of the process. Along the way, the last part of the puzzle was probably attending writers' conferences, like the Squaw Valley Writers' Conference, and subjecting my work to it's a tough love critiquing environment that really helped me get better. But sometimes you just have to put the time in. As far as my big break, it was a little break, and it was powerful for me. I was writing a lot of flash fiction, little tiny pieces, submitting them online to literary journals or contests, and a woman whose husband was she doesn't write, but her husband won the Iowa Book Award. He's a literary writer. She's a voluminous reader. She stumbled upon something and out of the blue emailed me and said, "What are you doing? Aim higher. You should go to some of these conferences. You should look for a wider audience because I think your work has enormous potential." Her name's Jen Petty, and I've never met her to this day. We've corresponded, and I mentioned her in my first book. And, for me, that was this really interesting validation for someone, this random stranger, to pull me aside and say, I actually kind of know what I'm talking about, and I really like your work, and you really should focus in this direction. That led to, just the validation was important, but that led to a lot of other opportunities down the road.
Very interesting. Well, now, what advice do you have for writers who are trying to break into this tough publishing game?
Ooh, so many different little bits of advice. These two go hand in hand. One I always say is, if you're trying to write, don't necessarily read the best fiction you can get your hands on or your favorites. And I say that because it's like only reading Vogue magazine while you're trying to lose weight. You will die a death of comparisons, and it's very discouraging. And so what I recommend, and I've said this to many people, someone said it to me, and I actually did it. It was very helpful. Was go to a garage sale and buy 3 books for $0.05 a piece, out of print, just the most awful books you can find, and force yourself to read them with a writer's eye and pay attention to point of view and tense and how the books open and how the order of exposition, how the story is told, and analyze it. And you learn a lot from reading really bad writing. It's terrible. I'm not saying read exclusively bad writing, but if you are able to recognize it in this one canvas, you're apt to recognize it in your own storytelling. So when you go back to the keyboard and you're writing, you'll notice your own bad habits and you'll self-correct. And for me, it was the cheapest advice I've ever been given that was the most effective.
Well, Songs of Willow Frost is a beautiful book, and thank you very much, Jamie Ford, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Jamie Ford, author of Songs of Willow Frost, just out from Ballantine and in bookstores everywhere.